Chris is possibly the longest serving cartographer in government employ in New Zealand at the moment. All the old ones have either died or retired or still drawing maps elsewhere. Chris was a foundation member of the Cartographic Society, and for many years he was the treasurer. He has an acute awareness of the third dimension. As a photogrammetrist, of course, he can wind his handles and look at two photos at once. But he used to be tramping the hills and mountains and the Alps and the Tararus to the north of us. So he has earned that third dimension with the sweat of his brow, which is a good thing. He's had a 30-year career as a photogrammetrist, then later through management positions, and now as a technical leader of Lindsay's Topo team. So he's been around through a lot, and he will walk us through that in a moment. Chris has been part of the history of mapping in New Zealand and continues to make history as we move forward and as Linz and its digital data moves. And as an old hand, I'm pleased to see these things, but also pleased that people like Chris and his team are there bringing some reality to the virtual digital world. It takes courage to move from the optical, mechanical photogrammetry and map drawing through into the digital world. You can't do it lightly, and it takes time and money, but mainly it takes inspiration and a belief that what you're doing is worthwhile and will be used. Looking back over your shoulder is often a good way to see where you're going, and that's what Chris will do for us today. Look over our shoulder so we can see looking forward.
My talk is months to minutes, and it's really about the evolution of the production of our national mapping series. I think it'd be fair to say that back in the 1930s and probably earlier than that, we were producing paper maps. We still do. So it's not really about the product itself, or the product comes into it, but it's really about how we evolved from the manual means through to the way we do things now in a digital manner. It all started back in 1936 when a government committee got together and decided we needed a new national mapping series. It was called at that time the 1 mile series. The contour interval was 100 feet. The first sheet published in 1939, and the map you can see there on the screen is the first one, and as Trevor mentioned, there's a copy of it in the library, up in the National Library there. A very important sheet. Interesting enough, as I said, the series was actually called the 1 mile series. However, in 1948, with the introduction of the Land Act, the Department of Lands and Survey was made the official mapping agency, and at that time the New Zealand Map Service was introduced. Many people have asked me over the years, what does NZMS stand for? Well, that's what it stands for. And the inch to the mile, being the first national series, became NZMS 1s. However, I'm not going to dwell on the NZMS 1 series because, contrary to popular belief, I wasn't actually around in the 1930s. So we'll move on to the Topo, or the NZMS 260 series. So by 1969, New Zealand had adopted the metric measurements. NZMS 1 series are out of date, probably difficult to produce. As it says there, the time was right for a new national series. It was decided to go metric. Well, the metric was the reason for going to the new series, basically. So it was going to be 50,000 scale, 20 metre contours. Now, for the first time, a new projection was created that combined both the North Island and the South Island at that scale. There'd been projections that had New Zealand mapped, but at a much smaller scale. So this was the first time that a 50 thou product, a single projection covering the country. But the big thing here was it was going to be mapped from new aerial photography, new photogrammetry, and obviously cartography. Now I've got a little story here. I had a visit from one of Linz's policy people about a year ago. It was some nice young fellow, probably straight out of university. He came up to me and he said, "Chris," he said, "would you happen to have a copy of the business case for the NZMS 260 series?" I said, "Are you joking?" I said, "That was established in 1972. Business cases are a modern infliction on us all." So, no, there wasn't one. In fact, I suspect back then it was a directive. I have no doubt that the Surveyor General of the day probably looked around and said, "Oh, we've got a metric. We must have a new map series. Get on with it." And that's pretty much how it would have happened. So the photo there is T12, the first sheet published in 1978. Now I'll talk about a bit how he did it. As I said, new photography and photogrammetry. For those people here that are not photogrammetrists, I will have to give you a little bit of aerial photography 101, I suspect. Back then, and to a certain extent today, aerial photography was flown in strips with a 60% forward overlap. These days the overlap is quite larger than that, but back then it was 60%. And the reason for that, well, basically by flying with a 60% overlap, you are photographing the same piece of land from two different viewpoints. And when you do that, you can actually view them in three dimensions. That gives us the power to map stereoscopically. Now, if you're a good photogrammetrist, you can actually take the prints. The area in the middle is called the stereo model. Now, if you're a really good photogrammetrist, you can train your eye so that the left eye looks at the left image, the right eye looks at the right image, and in front of you, you'll see a three-dimensional picture. That is quite doable. I'm quite good at it. However, using a stereo is easier to get the same thing. So it's important to understand that we do have stereoscopic imagery. The aircraft down there was the aircraft that was used to fly most of the flying back then. It was a Rockwell Commander. It was actually owned by the government, but leased to NZAM, New Zealand Aerial Mapping, who unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. Now we come to the traditional photogrammetry. I heard someone say, oh, it must have been this morning, photogrammetry, if you want to define what it actually means measurements of photographs. We would just basically describe it as mapping from aerial photography. But I suspect if you talk to someone today, they'll say data capture off imagery. So it's sort of evolved into a different type of thinking. The instrument on the left here is the Wild B8. Now this was the workhorse of capture. So basically the idea here is to capture off those photographs all the information that will ultimately go down to make the printed map. We have on the left hand side and the right hand side two what we call stage plates. The negatives are printed on glass, and the reason they're printed on glass is so that light can be passed through them, and the dome above here is the light source. Underneath this the stage plate, or underneath the diapositive, is a little lens, and it picks up the image and it transports it up here, through here, down here, and basically to the eyepiece. So effectively, the left eye looks at the left eyepiece, left image, the right eye looks at the right image, and straight away you'll see a three-dimensional picture. It's, if you want to see exactly what we were looking at, you can look in the stereoscope that's up in the mirror stereoscope in the Unfolding to the Map exhibition, and you'll get a fair idea of what we were looking at. The big difference though, in each optical train is a little black dot. And this was called the measuring mark, one on each side, and because there's two, they appear, your eyes fuse them into one single dot. And depending on their position, they will either float above the ground or they'll be way down below the ground. Effectively, to control that, we had, well, basically to control the position of the dot, we had this thing here called a tracing table. And there's two handles on it, and you just pushed it around, and everywhere you pushed it, the dot would just push the dot around accordingly. On the right hand side, just under here, is a wheel which controlled the Z. So it was this little wheel that you moved up and down to bring that dot down to the ground. When it was on the ground, the light rays from the same point are intersecting, and you're measuring its true spatial position. This, incidentally, is a mechanical solution to the digital solution that we were talking about at the, there was a session this morning from Survey. It was talking about all the parameters and the unknowns. This is the mechanical solution to the same problem. So the problems haven't changed, just the way we solve them. Out to the right is a pantograph with a pencil. So as you move this around, the pencil would draw. That's as simple as it was, but it took a fair bit of practice. The imagery over here, or the photo over here, is just a better photo of the pantograph and the pencil. And effectively, you would just start off keeping the dot on the ground, tracing down through rivers, roads, any piece of information that you want. The pencil would follow suit. Now when we came to do contours, we used to put an overlay on top. And the contours were run by hand. Again, people these days seem to think that all contours came from, derived from digital elevation models. Not the case. So you would go to the lowest point of the stereo model, you would raise the height to the next 20 metre value, and you'd move to the left, and you'd basically run round the hill, keeping the dot always on the ground. That's how we did the contours, and the contours that we were mapping on those machines 35 plus years ago are still the ones we use to this day. They've never been updated. And not only that, every now and again when they're matched up against contours derived from LiDAR, they hold up very well. They're still very good position. Now, this photo. This is not strictly national mapping, but it is photogrammetry. What we have on the left-hand side is a wild A8 stereo plotter. Now, this one was involved in engineering mapping. And again, you can probably see over here the two plates, one over the two stage plates, one on the left, one on the right. There was an optical train exactly the same way. The operator there is looking through the eyepieces. But in this case, we had two hand wheels. The hand wheel on the left would drive a carriage which would drive the dot in the X direction. The hand wheel on the right drove it up and down in the Y. And down here on the ground is the foot pedal, and it was the foot pedal that controlled the height. So when you're mapping contours, this is what it was like. You're doing all of this. When you're doing, if you're mapping a stream or something that comes down from a high mountain, your foot's going at the same time, so you're doing all of this. I tell you what, we got quite good at it. But there was something else which was rather amusing, and this caught me out. On the left-hand side here is a foot switch, and that controls this pencil here. That pencil was raised and lowered by an electromagnet. Because you couldn't actually reach across to it, so this pedal would operate it. And I used to be a great fan for listening to music, particularly the rock music of the 60s. So I'd be sitting there doing contours and my left foot would start tapping to the music, and suddenly you'll find all my line work became a dashed line. Very tricky. On the right hand side here, we have a check. This was the QA in the checking of the instrument plots. This fella here was one Mac Downing. Now I've got a story to tell about him. There's Mac, and this lovely young female here talking to him is Joyce, at that time Joyce Macbeth. I was sitting in the room one day with Joyce was there, Mac was there, and he was checking away something, and he suddenly looked up and said, "There's an awful lot of glaciers in the South Island here, and most of them don't have names." He said, "Joyce, would you like a glacier named after you?" And she said, "Oh yeah, why not? Okay." He said, "That's it. The Macbeth Glacier has now been named." I was always curious as to how far that got. If you go searching for our gazetteer, if you go searching for all our names, you won't find a Macbeth Glacier. Somewhere along the line it was intercepted by the powers that be and quite rightly removed. But that was what it was like. Now there's something else about this photo, which on this slide. As I said, that's Joyce, and for those that haven't actually guessed it, that's me on the instrument over there. Joyce and I started together on exactly the same day. It was in January 1967, and we actually met at Market Gardens building in Wakefield Street, and we had to come down to head office to sign all the official papers, and head office was right there in that building behind where we are today. And I don't think I've been in this campus since that day, 50 odd years ago, until yesterday. But even more amazing about this, Joyce and I started on the same day. Joyce and I still sit virtually side by side. Joyce is also part of the mapping team, still is. Right, so that was sort of photogrammetry. Moving on to cartography. Now, I'm not a cartographer. However, I know that cartography is complex. I hear them talking about right reading positives, reverse reading positives, right reading negatives, screens, masks, dropouts. This was a complicated process, and I suspect there's a lot of people here that know more about cartography than I do. However, the three photos on the slide tend to cover the main elements of cartography. In the top left-hand corner there, you've got some fellow, Chris I think it was actually, scribing contours. Now, for those people that are not cartographers, scribing was one of the mainstays of the map production, and how it works was you had a sheet of clear material with an orange coating on the top. This would be put on a light table so you could sort of see through it, but on top of that orange coating, those instrument plots that you saw us producing on the B8s would have been imprinted on top, and the cartographer then gets a sapphire tip cutter and he used to trace down the lines, cutting a nice clean transparent line. That would be the basis of most of the work they were doing. I think they had special cutters for roads, which was a double-edged cutter, and they probably had all sorts of other quite nice tools for doing symbols and what have you. Very time consuming, 60 to 80 days per sheet, and that's per 260 sheet. The other aspect, or another important aspect of the 260s, of course, is hill shading. We have Peter Robbins here busy working on a hill shading sheet, and that was another thing that was a real work of art. Basically, you had our contours, or they would have scribed the contours by then. The contours were probably used as underneath, again on the light table, and they imagined the sun was coming in from the top left-hand corner. So basically, they had a neutral grey sheet to start with, and where they envisaged the sun would hit the northeast side or the northwest side of the slopes, they would rub it with a little rubber to expose the white. And on the shadowy side, they had a big black pencil that they would colour it in black. And working their way right through the sheet, they would build up a relief pattern like you're seeing there. The third photo is text placement, and that's Dave Moll, who still works on them today. But there's a biosecurity man now, I think he is. Basically, the text was printed on very thin film called stripping film. It had a little wax backing on it. You could peel it off, you'd place it onto one of these sheets, and then you'd burnish it with a rubber or something. I remember when I did a bit of this, where I used a light bulb, and that would sort of melt the wax and the text would stick to the material. I understand that in this whole process, it would go through numerous, there'd be sheets, there'd be, I say, reversals, then they'd turn them into a right reading, then there'd be a negative, and then there'd be something else. And I've been told there'd been about 20 sheets of film would have been produced before you finally get to what they're ultimately trying to get, which is one sheet per colour. In other words, they were trying to ultimately end up with 6 sheets that they would send out to the printer to print the map. Each sheet would represent or would show all the symbols, all the text pertaining to one colour. That's plate copy material, ultimately what goes to the printer, as I said. That carried on fine, there was no problem with that. However, on the 1st of July 1987, Lands and Survey morphed into DOSLI. In fact, that was the big conservation shake-up, and at that time DOC was created. Lands and Survey, until then, used to administer all national parks. So the whole survey side of Lands and Survey basically became the Department of Survey and Land Information. The interesting thing about DOSLI was that it was a lot more focused on costs and cost recovery. I don't think we ever heard the cost ever mentioned in the Lands and Survey Department. You just sort of did things. I take it there was somebody behind the scenes keeping track of money, but certainly not like DOSLI. The work on first edition sheets continued, the traditional way of doing it, as we've seen. However, the interesting thing about DOSLI in '87 was the impact of computers. Now, for the first time, PCs were starting to make an impact, and there was a need, or there was a expectation for digital data. Many of the first edition 260 sheets were now being remade as second edition sheets, and so the computers were being used in to help this. So they weren't actually doing the work, but in those days it was more CAD, computer-aided drafting, that was being used to assist. But from our point of view, what we found very important was that in DOSLI, work started on a fully automated map production system. So I personally wasn't involved at that stage. I was still in photogram, doing whatever we were doing in photogram. But I understand that they were working with the software supplier, which was, I'm not too sure if it was One Spatial then, it was still Laser Scan, but it was certainly one of those two. And they started looking at this sort of automated mapping. And as I said, there was a bit of a demand for digital data. So not long after DOSLI was created, work started on the creation of a true digital topographic database. And to do that, they started digitising that plate copy. The plate copy I mentioned, and it went down to the printer, was the best way to start creating the digital data. There was a combination of semi-automated techniques, line-following techniques were used to capture the contours, but there's an awful lot of manual digitising, and that photo there shows an example of somebody digitising off a table. Interesting, as I said, DOSLI was a department that was very focused on cost recovery. So as the data became available, we were selling it, and we were probably selling it for as much as we could legally get away with. And as it says there, if you wanted the full data set, certainly in the later days of DOSLI, we didn't have everything captured, but we certainly would have had a lot captured. We were talking about $1.5 million for the full data set. And I believe it was sold at least once, if not twice. 10 years later, July 1996, DOSLI was dissolved. And that wasn't surprising. DOSLI by this time had a serious identity crisis. It didn't really know whether it was a government department or a commercial business. Because when we were selling the data like we were, there was no way that it was a government department. So, July 1996, LINZ was established. LINZ was established as a regulatory department to produce standards, programs. However, they did retain the digital database, so it was deemed to be a national asset and it wasn't going to go to any other company. By the way, the split was pretty 50-50. From Survey and Land Information we had LINZ as the regulatory side. TerraLink was the SOE that was created to handle all the commercial work. The interesting thing was, and I've got another little story to tell you here. Oh, that's right, retained the digital database, but we weren't to do any of the work. We had to outsource all the work. And that leads me to say, or tell you the story of why am I in LINZ? Because I was a photogrammetrist, and all the work that I was doing went to Terrelink. But I'm in Linz. Well, 3 days before the end of Dosley, I was approached by one Jeff Howard, who was the manager in charge of basic mapping at that stage. And he came up to me and he said, Chris, he said, how would you like a job in Linz? I said, Jeff, I'm a photogrammetrist. All photogrammetry is going to Dosley, to Terrelink. What are you talking about? He said, Chris says, you know, we have to outsource all our work. We need contract managers. I said, I don't know anything about contracting, contract management. He said, nobody does. We're all going to learn together. So I said, okay. So on the 1st of July 1996, I duly arrived at Linz, had a desk, sat down, asked him, what's this contracting all about? Later that same day, I had a phone call from a manager in Terrelink. He said, Chris, where are you? I said, I'm in Linz. He said, what are you doing there? I said, I'm sorry, I've got a new job. I've jumped ship. As it turned out, it was probably one of the most fortunate things that ever happened to me. Within about 3 years, most of my peers in Terrelink had all been made redundant. And we'll get on to that in a minute, but that's how I came to be Linz, as a contract manager. So basically, outsourcing. This was why I was employed. And there's about 3 of us at the time that were basically trying to manage contracts. The comments that I make about outsourcing, by the way, here, relate specifically to the outsourcing of map production. Everything that Linz produced or needed producing was outsourced, but there are different degrees of the 260 series. It wasn't first edition, so by now they were getting digital data. The company in Brisbane, Air Research, said they had a cartographer or 2. They had some programmers. They could do all this map production. So we thought, well, seeing as the only other company was Terrelink and we weren't too sure whether we should continue giving everything to one company, we gave Air Research mapping. If I remember rightly, it was a small number of sheets, probably 2 or 3, maybe a bit more. And no problem, they did them quite well. And they printed them in Brisbane and shipped them back to New Zealand. Not a big deal, it worked okay. The next year, I remember quite well too, because by this time there was, I think the signs were there that Terrelink wasn't in good status. They were definitely starting to make people redundant, and they were definitely laying off cartographers. So this sort of made us a bit nervous. And in 2001, I think it would have been about the time that Terrelink were talking about going into receivership, we tendered quite a large number of sheets. Somewhere around about 30 sheets were being outdated. And Air Research Mapping put a bid in, and because we weren't comfortable about Terrelink, we virtually gave Air Research Mapping most of them. Certainly an awful lot. Big mistake. It wasn't difficult to do 2 or 3 sheets in a year. However, when we gave them that amount, that was another story, and I distinctly remember about 90% of the year through, or completed, they had only done about half the work. And myself and my colleague Paul suddenly had to make a rush trip over to Brisbane, because one of the things that was slowing everything down was there were a lot of sort of checking stages that had to be done by Linz. Which means that they were doing a certain amount of work and then couriering sheets, particularly printing proofs, back to New Zealand. And we said, what a waste of time, it was far better if we went over there. So myself and Paul went over there and spent probably a month, maybe 6 weeks, living in Brisbane and basically spending an awful lot of time in the local printing shop. I remember that. However, they did continue, they did get the work done. In 2002, Air Research was bought out by Fugro Spatial Solutions. Now, if there probably somebody here that knows who Fugro are, but they're a fairly huge multinational geophysical company. They specialise in seismic surveys, and they bought out Air Research. They weren't out there, they weren't in the business of making friends or having good relations. Suddenly the prices went up tremendously, quite dramatically. And they again laid off cartographers. So we were not happy about that, and I don't think after 2000, possibly 2003, something like that, they got their last sheet. We never went back to them, which was a shame because the trips to Brisbane were quite good. So in 2002, some of the cartographers that had left Terralink went and joined the company SKM in Wellington, Sinclair Knight Nurse. Luckily for us, they were cartographers that had worked in Dosley. They knew what they were doing, so they started picking up our work, and from Terralink, the Terralink SOE morphed into Terralink International, a private firm, and fortunately again they kept a number of cartographers, and they also continued to get work. So effectively the two companies continued to get our work until the end of the outsourcing era. Basically we tendered, I say, every year, which was frustrating for us. It meant a lot of work. But for the companies, the biggest frustration was that the work packages they were getting were quite small. They each knew they were getting half, and both of them were trying to convince me and others that they could do the whole lot, but we weren't too sure. Were they both going to survive? Who was going to go under next? Where was the future? So we continued to give them small packets of work. They were reluctant to invest in technology. They wouldn't invest in training simply because they didn't know from one day to the next how much work they were going to get. So the word frustrating would probably sum up the whole outsourcing era. The production of the first editions to 60 series did continue into July 1997, and this sheet that's visible here was the last sheet to be produced. This is B43 DAG, and it was one of only 6 sheets that was actually produced from digital data from scratch. So all the manual techniques didn't apply to this simply because those instruments that I showed you earlier, the Wild B8 and some other instruments we had been fitted with encoders, so they could now produce digital data straight at the photogrammetric stage. So Terralink, who did this sheet, used CAD techniques, so they were using MicroStation, possibly Intergraph. I'm not too sure if they were using Esri in those days, but they basically produced that map using digital methods. Now this map is interesting for another reason. I'm not too sure if you can see where you guys are viewing up there, but down in here you can see a logo. That's the Terralink logo, and that was put on these last 6 sheets without any knowledge of anyone in Linz. And I remember clearly the day when this sheet was presented to us, because part of the contract they had to supply was 10 printed copies. And I remember having this sent to us, and we opened it and we saw this logo on the bottom. Well, the chief topographer of the time, one John Spittle, for those that know him, virtually had a heart attack on the spot when he saw this logo. How dare they put a logo on my map without telling me or asking our approval? He virtually nearly made them scrap the entire lot and reprint. Luckily common sense prevailed. The sheets did carry on. So if you might find a few with a Dosley, a Terralink logo on them. Through all this outsourcing era, Linz wasn't lying idle. They were looking at a new topographic strategy. By now, or in the year 2000, a new datum had been introduced, and a new global projection, a new transverse Mercator projection had been mooted for New Zealand. It wasn't actually ratified back in 2000, but it was certainly, we knew of its existence. The printing technologies were changing from the old film to digital to plate, so we were having a lot of trouble now taking those, all those plate copied film that we used to use. We were still using them to reprint, even though we were doing a lot of 2nd edition and 3rd edition sheets. We were also reprinting some of the 1st edition sheets, ones that hadn't had much change on them. And to do that, we basically just sent this film down to the printer. However, they, as I said, they were switching to digital to plate, so that was also becoming tricky. And by now, within LINS, we had now a well-structured digital topo database. The database was complete, all first edition sheets had been finished, so we had that. And it was agreed that we would have a new topo mapping series. That was the start of the Topo 50. Much the same as the 260s, 50 thou scale, contour interval 20 metres. The big difference being the datum was New Zealand datum 2000, and the projection would be the New Zealand transverse Mercator 2000. Unlike the 260s, this was going to be done from existing data. There was no plans to remap New Zealand. It was, as I said, going to be done from the data we had. At the time, when we produced some of the, I suppose, the early proofs, there was a number of people that said, why does it look like a 260? Why don't you take this opportunity to do something quite radically different? But the reason why we didn't was that some of our key stakeholders, in particular the police, were adamant that if we were going to do a new series, please make it look like the 260s. Because the 260 was a great series, the pinnacle of mapping, according to my colleague Graham Jupp. And they spent a lot of time on training their staff on map reading. They had a lot of material from the 260 days, and they pleaded with us to make the new series look the same. The only thing that we had to do, we did do, was we rotated it from a landscape to a portrait, and that was so we could very quickly look at the sheet and you could tell which was a Topo 50 and which was a 260. There's 445 sheets covering New Zealand, and there's 6 sheets covering the Chatham Islands. Now, all 451 sheets were produced and released to the public on the same day. That day was the 23rd of September 2009. Now, remember, it was only ratified, or the series was actually finalised, if you like, or the need to go ahead and do it, in 2005. Incidentally, there was a business case for this series, probably the first time a business case had ever been made for a map series. So, on the 23rd of September, we believe that was a world first. We don't know if anywhere else in the world they've actually been able to effectively take away one series on one day and replace the whole country with a new series the next day. So how did we do that? I mean, we've already said that the manual methods, of course, were very, very slow, but we basically brought it back in-house. We decided that the key thing was the business case was all built around completing the development of the automated map production system, the system that we had put on hold when LINS was created. We brought it back and we continued it. A project team was set up with a lot of very clever people, both here at LINS and our software supplier, One Spatial over in the UK. We created the LINS pre-press system. Now, this is a fully automated map production system. We basically can extract the data out of the database and produce the output files that go to the printer in 8 to 12 minutes. So basically, that was the whole process reduced from 8 to 12 months. And to be fair to the outsourcing people, when they were using CAD techniques, they had reduced the time from months to weeks. And they were producing second and third editions in probably 2 to 3 weeks. But now we were down to 8 to 12 minutes. That's just a photo of the pre-press. Interesting enough, it's 3 separate computers. Not long after it was put together, we had one of the IT people said, why is it on 3 separate computers? Why can't we just put it on one big server? So we said, you go for it. And he spent an awful lot of time, eventually got all the software that runs on independent computers, he got them running on a single server, and it went at half speed. So we went back down to the 3 computers, and we still have that to this day. The outputs from the pre-press. The first and most important output is a PostScript file. It's a single file, but it's got 6 pages. 1 page for each colour we send to the press. So here we have the exact digital output, plate copy if you like, or digital output that replicated the plate copy we used to do in the manual cartographic days. We at the moment can run that pre-press, we can set it up, set it running, 8 to 10 minutes later a sheet can be completed, the PostScript file can be put on the FTP, and it can be at our printing press. This is PrintLink in Petone, it's not ours, it's a private firm, but they have won the contract, so that's outsourcing. It can be that quick, and it's not uncommon for us to virtually run the system in the morning and put a file on it straight away so it can go to the press that afternoon. But wait, there's more. For the first time, we can now produce digital raster files. In the past, we could only get these by scanning printed maps. Now we can produce them within the system. The TIFF format is identical to the printed map, full map sheet, panel, legend, the whole thing. And when we outputted these, the object was pretty much for people that could plot them on a large format inkjet plotter or anything else. And this photo here shows that sheet being plotted in our plotter in Linz. This is becoming fairly important now. With you'll hear probably more from Aaron than from me at the moment. You'll hear about the future of maps, and you'll hear a lot about plotting on demand. And it's these files that will be sent to do that. We can produce them out of our pre-press at 200 dpi, 300 dpi or 600 dpi. We tend to do 300 and 600, but interesting enough, we can select the sheet, and we can say for that sheet we want PostScript and we want TIFF. If we select the TIFF as well, instead of taking say 10 minutes, it might take 10 minutes and 30 seconds. It doesn't take much longer to do one of these sheets, that's for sure. But wait, there's even more. We can do GeoTIFFs. This is the first time GeoTIFFs and hopefully everybody here understands a GeoTIFF. These started to become very popular probably 10 years ago now, probably a bit longer. And basically the GeoTIFF is just the map information of the Topo 50 with a geotag embedded inside it. We don't use TFW files or anything, it's actually embedded in the image. And these are designed for GIS systems. Very popular and used widely. You'll actually see these GeoTIFFs on websites like the Walking Access Commission. I think DOC certainly use them on theirs, and I have no doubt there are plenty of others that use them as well. Another thing that we can produce on our pre-press, incidentally, if we do a PostScript, a TIFF and a GeoTIFF, it might take now about 11 minutes, another 30 to 40 seconds for each of these outputs. About 3 years ago we were asked by New Zealand Defence Force at Devonport, would it be possible to produce a GeoTIFF without a grid? Now this sort of made sense because GeoTIFFs are designed for use in GIS systems, and basically a grid on a map is primarily there to help you locate yourself using grid references. So if you were using it in a GIS system where you can just move the cursor around, then basically the grid is probably not necessary. So yes, we said we can do that, and we did. So we can now produce these GeoTIFFs without a grid. I believe the Defence really wanted them without a grid, not to use them in a GIS, but so they could impose their own, they could plot them with their own grid. They have a military grid system that they use. And of course, on the right-hand side here, the GeoTIFFs are now being used in third-party smart devices such as tablets, cell phones, GPSs, you name it. And I've got an interesting little story about this one. 3 years ago, I went over to the air show in the Wairarapa, and while I was there I noticed that there was a display from the local land search and rescue people. So I thought, oh yes, I'll go and have a look at that because I know they use our maps. And as I went into their tent, pleased to see our maps on the wall, maps laid out on the table, obviously in use. So I went up and introduced myself and said, "Hi, I'm Chris, I work for Linz. I'm part of the team that produces these maps. What do you think of them?" They said, "Oh, they're good, love your maps." I hate to say that. We use them all the time, but he said, "But look," he said, "I want to show you what we're using now." He went away and he came back with his iPad and he brought up one of our geotiffs. He said, "Look, we've got these." He said, "They're really good because you can zoom all around the country, and in some cases they're more up to date than your maps." I said, "Oh," I said, "and who do you think makes those?" He said, "Oh, Mr. Memory Map. Memory Map make these." I said, "Listen, son, I got news for you." No, he doesn't. We do. And he was quite surprised because he had only ever associated Linz and Dosley and Lands and Survey with the paper map. Didn't associate us at all with the digital version. He learned that day. Now, the pre-press. I won't spend too much time on this. It's a very complex system and it's very smart. And it has been the subject of numerous presentations at conferences like this in the past. But for those people that haven't seen it, I'll just illustrate some of, or just a couple of some of the smart features within that system. The first thing on this particular one is the dynamic cliff symbols. If you look in this area here, you can see a cliff symbol with a grid tick over here. And it imposes itself, or it covers the river underneath. The pre-press actually changes the size of that tick. It's not covering it with the river, it's actually reducing the size of the tick so that it doesn't cover the line feature underneath. That sample there unfortunately covers the entire grid tick, but they can go from full size down to virtually nothing, and that's the power of the system just basically moving the grid tick in and out. That's one of the very clever features that it does. Another one is the bridge leads. At the moment, when we are capturing data or updating the underlying data, we try to plot or capture everything in its true spatial position. If you made a map with everything in its true spatial position with the symbols that we use, you'll sort of end up with things not looking cartographically right. So the pre-press in situations like this where a bridge would encroach onto a road and over the casing, it straight away moves it, shortens the bridge and basically tidies it up so that it looks more cartographically correct. The underlying data is not touched. This is simply the representation or the way the final file will be presented. The data stays in its true position. Now this third feature, and this is only one of many, but I'm not going to be here all day talking about all the features. This is contours through ice, and this is one of the more demanding programming challenges. But what we have here is contours, and you can see polygons, which are basically snow and ice polygons. We have highlighted a single contour line. This contour line is a continuous line, it's not segmented, and it has just one attribute, and that's its height, nothing else. However, when it goes through the pre-press, that line will turn blue where it goes through the snow and ice. It will turn back to orange as it goes back out of the snow and ice. As I said, this probably looks quite simple on the surface, but remember the line is not segmented, it is not tagged in any way. This is the power of the pre-press and an object-oriented database. So this is a continuous line just highlighting how it all goes through the ice and snow. This slide is quickly illustrating what's happening to our sales and distribution of maps and data. The line up here, it represents our sales of our paper maps, and as probably predicted in this day and age, sales are declining. Not dramatically. I mean, last year we were still selling 61,000 maps, which is still quite good considering I was told by our policy people 5 years ago that paper's dead. We still seem to be selling them. However, when you look down here at these blue bar graphs, this is the downloads off the Linz website of our TIFFs and GeoTIFFs. And last year The combined TIFF and GeoTIFF, that's about 77,000 downloads just off the LINZ website. So there's definitely a demand for our digital data and definitely a demand for maps, albeit probably in slightly different formats.